Hello, old sport. Chapter 4 begins with the aftermath of Gatsby's party, where rumors still swirl about him. This time he's a bootlegger, and Nick observes that his guests paid him the subtle tribute of knowing nothing whatever about him. What follows is about 3 pages worth of Nick just listing name after name of guests who showed up to Gatsby's parties, which seems really unnecessary, except that you see Nick, or Fitzgerald perhaps, is putting this story on a new sort of plane. You see, long lists like this are called catalogues, and you see catalogues like this in stories that are considered epics, such as in the Iliad, when Homer takes an equally long time just listing the names of cities and how many ships they sent to the Trojan War. So the Great Gatsby then can, in some ways, be considered a sort of American epic. In this chapter, Nick becomes super skeptical of Gatsby. He hardly thinks a nice thought about him throughout the entire chapter, seeing Gatsby as a bit of a fake and definitely annoying. Yet the mystique of Gatsby's background and aura of his persona still hover in the air, and even though we learn more about Gatsby in this chapter, we're also left, like Nick, a little perplexed by the man as well. Nick and Gatsby end up taking a ride into New York City. And Gatsby, by the way, has a really, really sweet yellow car that gets no shortage of attention. But the whole ride feels a little staged to Nick. He calls it the disconcerting ride, where Gatsby begins to explain his background to Nick, seemingly an attempt to clarify the truth behind the rumors that have swirled around his persona. He says he's from a rich Midwest family, lost his family, fought in the war, attended Oxford, traveled the world. All really interesting stuff, but Nick senses that Gatsby's story has been rehearsed, and the way he talks to Nick leads him to believe his whole statement fell to pieces, and I wondered if there wasn't something a little sinister about him after all. Gatsby doesn't help himself much when he claims to be from a small Midwestern town named San Francisco. It's no wonder that Nick gets really skeptical and says he could hardly constrain his incredulous laughter, and Gatsby's phrases were worn so threadbare. But then Nick is left a little puzzled when Gatsby shows him a war medal and a photograph at Oxford that supports his story. What's more interesting is that Gatsby describes himself as a drifter, much like Nick describes Tom, showing that despite the money these guys have, there's something very deep and integral that they're lacking. As they head into New York, we get a really beautiful portrait of what it's like to drive into the thriving, vibrant city. A city is a place of magic and wonder where Nick observes anything can happen. And then he adds, even Gatsby could happen. Reinforcing the notion that Gatsby is more of an event than a character, more of a persona than a person. And because Gatsby isn't mysterious enough, let's add to his aura by showing that he is a close associate of a very creepy guy named Meyer Wolfsheim, who's a gambler who talks freely about dark money, gangster ties, and he offers a sinister business connection. He fixed the World Series, and yes, he's actually wearing a human molar as a cuff button. Wolfsheim tells a story of how he was present the night Rosie Rosenthal was murdered, and this is a real event that happened that Fitzgerald draws on to show the kind of associates Wolfsheim kept. And oddly enough, this man seems to try to speak on behalf of Gatsby, coming out of the blue and suggesting to Nick he would never so much as look at a friend's wife, whatever that's supposed to mean. Wolfsheim has allegedly known Gatsby for years, and it makes us wonder, what is Gatsby doing hanging around with a guy like Wolfsheim? And after Wolfsheim excuses himself from their lunch table, Gatsby himself oddly disappears when Nick happens to run into Tom and tries to introduce the two. What could that mean? Nick doesn't know. But some of Gatsby's strange behavior is explained, finally, at the end of the chapter, when Nick sits down with Jordan Baker for tea that same afternoon. Nick was frustrated that Gatsby insisted he talk to Jordan about this matter, and even said in the car Nick was so confounded by Gatsby he was sorry I'd ever set foot upon his overpopulated lawn. But once Jordan shares the backstory of how Gatsby and Daisy briefly dated 5 years ago, Nick actually feels a little relieved and confused at how odd Gatsby is acting over such a little thing. So, apparently, 5 years ago, when Gatsby was in the war, he met Daisy in her hometown of Louisville when he was on leave, and the two fell in love. But because war is war, Gatsby was sent back to the front, during which time Daisy met Tom and married him. Right before the wedding, Daisy received a letter, presumably from Gatsby. She broke down into tears and refused to get married. Thanks to Jordan's help, Daisy eventually regained control, put on the pearl necklace Tom gave her, and got married. 5 years later, she's intrigued at hearing Gatsby's name again. What this explains about Gatsby is that he never let go of Daisy. He still loves her. And this clarifies his actions. He bought a mansion across the bay from her so he could stare at her house and dream. This is literally what we see him doing at the conclusion of chapter 1, although we didn't realize it at the time. He had parties hoping she would wander into his house one day. And that's why he's such a nerdy, nervous wreck about things. He's in love with a girl. This revelation redeems Gatsby in Nick's eyes. Although he was frustrated and confused early in the chapter, Nick now tells us that Gatsby came alive to me, delivered suddenly from the womb of his purposeless splendor. We ought to point out that right before Daisy's wedding, she was heartbroken, presumably over this mysterious letter and her fling with a young army officer named Gatsby. And right after the wedding, Tom is already having an affair. And again, we should point out this affair was discovered due to a car accident, strangely yet another incident of a crash and a wheel that comes off. This is becoming a motif. And that pearl necklace Daisy puts on strikes me as something of a symbol, and it reminds me of that other piece of jewelry we see in this chapter, Wolfsheim's sinister human molar cufflink, as though the decorations of the rich represent the literal owning of another human being. So Jordan Baker tells Nick this backstory of Gatsby's and concludes by passing along Gatsby's simple request, that Nick invite his cousin Daisy over to his house for tea, so that Gatsby can drop in. This request, though, is coupled with an interesting detail. Gatsby could arrange a meeting with Daisy anywhere, but Jordan tells Nick he specifically wants it at Nick's house because he wants her to see his house. Gatsby, as we know, has an awesome mansion, and for some reason he wants to flex this in front of Daisy upon the reunion. Now, some of the story's previous details make more sense. We see why Gatsby would be shy of Tom, since Gatsby is trying to connect with Tom's wife. We see why Gatsby was looking longingly across the waters of the bay. We see Gatsby's parties as a spectacle, hoping Daisy would trot in one evening. But there are other questions that still remain. Also, if you haven't caught on already, everybody in this novel is really young. Jordan Baker is about 21 years old, Daisy is 23, and Nick is just shy of 30, and Tom and Gatsby are just over 30. And I know maybe to you that might seem old, but they're all really, really young. That's it for this time. Until next time, see ya, old sport.